Hello, everyone, and welcome to WinMagic's speed webinar on Linux Unmanaged and Unsecured. I'm Melissa with WinMagic, and I will cover some logistics before we begin. We will be recording today's webinar, and the link will be shared with you in our post-webinar communication. Once the webinar ends, a new window with a brief survey will open up asking you for your feedback about our webinar. Please take a moment of your time to fill this in. Today, we have a panel with our longstanding and important partner, Ivanti. We have with us our moderator, Rahul Kumar, VP of Sales and Marketing, who will lead our expert speakers into the questions that matter most in the Linux world. We request you to share your comments and questions through the Q&A box. If we don't have the time to address them today, we will definitely get in touch with you over email. I will now turn this over to Rahul to take this further.
Thanks, Melissa. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're joining from. So thank you for taking the time, and we are here to talk about Linux and the challenges that we see on Linux and what our customers see in this short or rather crisp webinar for 20-25 minutes, and then we'll follow that up with questions, time permitting. So let me get right in here, and as you have seen, let me just move to the next slide. As Melissa said, we are doing this webinar along with Ivanti, one of our key alliance partners. And today we have Gary McCracken, who is the CISO and VP of Technology at WinMagic, and Chris Gettle, who is the Director of Product Management at Ivanti, talking to us about the topic on the challenges and the security vulnerabilities from a Linux standpoint. So let me dwell right in and get to the first part of the conversation. We kind of divide this conversation into three parts. So but the first one, really, I want to bring up Linux, and as the topic is, historically, this has been seen to be an operating system with no need for security. I mean, that's what it has been labeled as. And I'm sure the recent incidents over the last 2, 3, 5 years have busted that myth considerably, and considering the fact that we are seeing so much of breach, and it's not stopping, not that it is expected to stop. So let me bring in Gary here. Gary, what do you see as your experiences in this space?
Well, thanks, Rahul. Well, I mean, going sort of way back into the last century, I can remember the almost religious Windows versus Linux wars. And the rhetoric got pretty hot back then. I mean, at one time, Microsoft called Linux un-American. I think that probably had more to do with the licensing model and the, quote, free GPL license. But that model, the open source model, also came into play into security. Many people back then said, if it's open source, everybody can look at the open source, all the vulnerabilities can be easily found, and all those people can easily fix them. So, if we're good at open source, that's a great model. And some of the closed source people said, well, it's closed source, and it means the bad guys can't look at the source code. They can't find the vulnerabilities, and by the time they might have found them, our professionals would have found them and fixed them. So closed source is better for security. Fast forward 20 years, and like, who won those wars? Well, not really. No one really did. Microsoft, it came out recently after a SolarWinds attack, where attackers got read access to some of their source code and said, well, it doesn't really matter. We have an inner source model where there's wide access to our source code, and our source code security, it is not dependent on keeping it secret. So, that whole idea of keeping the source code secret so that bad guys couldn't look at the vulnerabilities is not something even Microsoft subscribes to. But on the flip side, does that mean that, open source and Linux, doesn't have any vulnerabilities? I found some research from late 2019 where they went from basically the turn of the century for the last 20 years and looked at the number of vulnerabilities in NIST National Vulnerability Database. Went through and counted up the technical ones. And Debian was actually number one on that list with 3,067 vulnerabilities. But there's a bunch of others. Apple's Mac OS was in there, 2,200. Linux kernel was in there for 2,357. So they all had a few. But when you also add up Windows, the various Windows releases over those years, and look at the number of vulnerabilities, it was like 2,400. So it was just in the middle of the pack. So I think it's pretty clear that no one operating system has a monopoly on vulnerabilities, and no operating system or kernel is without them. But moving a little bit further along that line of thinking, having a vulnerability isn't the same as exploiting it. And maybe historically, Windows vulnerabilities had been exploited more, probably because it was a bigger target. The more installed base you have, the more publicity you can get, the more assets you can get, the bigger target. But now with Linux becoming more and more popular and rolling out in many different areas, especially IoT, it's obviously going to be much more of a target and much more lucrative. So then, the third point, I think, when we talk about security and, is there some difference between Linux and Windows? Even vulnerabilities aside, these systems often, mostly, have data on them. And if the data needs to be protected, whether it's Windows or Linux. Let's say a drive gets stolen and there's data on there and it isn't encrypted. So even if the system has no vulnerabilities, the data can be extracted from the drive and you have a breach. So even then, whether it's Windows or Linux or whatever, data needs to be protected, and encryption is one of the methods to do that.
Thanks, Gary. And interesting that you bring up the point, and I'm just looking at of my notes here. The vulnerability numbers for Linux, if you sum them up, they outweigh possibly Windows 3:1, right? And again, Debian being the biggest one. Then there is Mac, which again is suspected to be the most secure operating system. But data aside, Chris, do you see this viewpoint of Linux operating system being secure or more secure changing amongst the customers?
Yeah, I think it's a mentality that's definitely shifting. To Gary's point before, it's all about who can you target the most. And as popularity of any technology becomes increased, that will be targeted more and more. And you'll also see that Microsoft was one of the first ones to really establish a very strict release and disclosure policy around vulnerabilities. But many of the other vendors over the last 3-4 years have started to ramp up. Gary talked about the 2019 numbers for vulnerabilities reported. Debian actually had 1,200 vulnerabilities in that 1 year, and that actually increased their total count to somewhere over 3,000 that they had reported in all time. So only in the last 3 years has Debian really started to step up how well they're disclosing that information to us. Not that those vulnerabilities didn't exist before. So we're seeing the total number of vulnerabilities being reported going up significantly. We're seeing organizations, take a more strict approach to securing their environment holistically. If you look at some of the bigger ransomware threat actors, SamSam back in the 2017, 2018 timeframe, one of their signature moves to get that first entry point onto your environment was targeting JBoss, Java servers that were public facing. And some of the other major ransomware threat actors have taken that additional, angle as well. So it's absolutely a security concern. Now you're seeing right now we're kind of in an evolving market. Windows is slowly coming down as far as the total server footprint out there. Linux is increasing, but IoT, if you take servers aside and just look at IoT, Linux is increasing exponentially on that side. So yeah, Linux devices are now everywhere. We're having to look at them, from a very different perspective than they did before. And I do agree with Gary that I think in the great debate of Windows versus Linux, which one, and throw Mac in there too, which one's more secure? I don't think anybody was right on that. None of them are secure. We all have to keep in mind software, hardware, doesn't matter. Inherently, it's going to have vulnerabilities in it. And that's something that we constantly have to monitor and respond to.
Thanks, Chris. And you bring up a very interesting point, and like both of you do, that none of the operating systems, none of these platforms are secure per se. But how do we? And that kind of takes me to the next topic of this conversation here. And as the driver, what is the driver within the ecosystem which drives the adoption of security? The biggest driver that I can think of is the regulatory framework, and what do they define? What do they define as the need for security? But these security driver frameworks have been there for a long time. But historically, we have not seen enough emphasis on securing the Linux part of the infrastructure. So let me ask Gary. Gary, does the compliances, or do the compliances look at or talk about operating systems differently here?
Well, generally not. Certainly when you talk about the government or national level compliance regulations and laws, they make great efforts to be technology agnostic. For instance, I had a look at GDPR, General Data Protection Rules, the famous one from Europe. And I searched for Linux and I searched for Windows. I didn't get one occurrence. By the way, I did search for encryption, and it was show up a few times as an example technology that you could use to protect your data, and as a pretty good thing to have if you had a data loss, so you wouldn't have to do breach reporting. But even then, something like GDPR doesn't prescribe doing something differently for Linux or Windows, or even mention it. Also, you take a look at something a little bit more nitty-gritty, prescriptive, like PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. I think practitioners might actually like that a little bit better, because it sort of tells you what to do in more detail. And if you search that, and you do get hits on Linux and Windows, but it's not to treat Windows and Linux differently. It's to say, well, make sure you don't forget your Windows systems and your Linux systems when you do your audit and when you put your controls in, and to treat them equally, and don't forget about anything. So there's no special treatment even in PCI DSS for Linux and Windows. But it was interesting when I did search PCI DSS for the word vulnerabilities, and I found it 86 times, which I thought that was pretty interesting. 86 times. And the kind of places that would show up, there's one sentence here. It says, compromises often happen due to unused or insecure devices, because vulnerabilities are known to exist, but they haven't patched. There's a lot of emphasis in the compliance standards, at least a little more nitty-gritty ones, about keeping patched and keeping the up to date. So I guess I would say in short, compliance regulations, whether they're government level or industry ones, don't give Linux or Windows special treatment. And if they're mentioned at all, it's just to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks.
Thanks, Gary. And you mentioned treat them equally, right? So compliance is really talking a lot of times say the operating systems need to be treated equally. Chris, do you see how do customers perceive it? And that's what I wanted to understand from you. How do you see customers talking about compliances for different operating systems?
Yeah, this is definitely something where, depending on which role you're in the company, your sysadmin, your server admin, at that level, they're more worried about, I've got to go and figure out, is my slice of the world compliant, and be able to report that up. The fact of the matter is, though, the CISO, the board, and the auditor need a holistic view of the world. And to Gary's point, it is not well, we don't need to worry about Linux, we don't need to worry about mobile, we don't need to worry about, no, they're worried about all of it. They need to make sure that you're addressing all of those angles. So as you're looking at this, it's one of those things where it is there's no bias between platforms. We have to take the same level of responsibility for anything that exists on the Windows platform or the Linux platform, or an IoT device, wherever that data or system might be. We've got to protect it with the same level of protection that we're required to do everywhere. So it's definitely something where companies need to make sure that they've got the right visibility, the right tools to make sure that they're compliant across all platforms, including Linux. One of the things that was interesting, and I read up on a Reddit post about Linux disk encryption, and they had two very specific camps. And those camps were divided very specifically into people with an operational concern and people with a compliance concern. So the people with the operational concern, they were saying, hey, what tool should I be using for, in the case of the original poster, Debian? How should I be doing full disk encryption for my Debian systems? The first challenge from the next person in there was, why are you worried about full disk encryption on the server? It's in your data center. And then there was this philosophical debate about, wait a second, do we need full disk encryption on devices that are in my data center? One person kind of, I could imagine them pounding their fist saying, I challenge you to come into my data center and try to remove that disk. It's not a problem. It's not a compliance issue, blah, blah, blah. There was definitely somebody who was more on the security side and on the audit side saying, so are you telling me that your data, your disk recycling services are coming straight into your data center? That disk is removed and destroyed or wiped securely before that device leaves your data center security perimeters. Can you guarantee that? Because that's what it really comes down to. Data protection is data protection. Is that data protected while it's moving? Is that data protected while it's at rest? Well, disposal is a very critical part of that. And that's what a regulatory compliance framework is prescribing here. It's not to say, yeah, while it's in your data center, it's protected, so you don't have to worry about disk encryption. No, it's saying the life of that data needs to be compliant all throughout. And if it's not, then you've got some serious gaps in there where you could have some pretty hefty fines that could expose your company to headlines, bad reputation with your customers, regulatory fines, identity theft coverage for your customers. All of those things carry costs. So, but it was interesting to see this. After years of compliance requirements being out there, there's still this deep philosophical debate of the operations people versus the security team, and going back and forth over, the same topics I've been seeing for over 15 years.
Thanks, Chris. And this is very interesting, right? You brought up a lot of points. Let me touch upon a couple of them. You talked about challenges on coming into data center and picking up a disk and going away. I think whoever wrote that on that thread maybe eating his words or her words right now, with all the red teaming and the blue teaming exercises that go in, and then people kind of go through data centers and sorry about that. Yeah, companies' security frameworks through these red teaming exercises. Also, from a disk recycling standpoint, we did see a study in Tokyo, Japan, when one of the large hardware OEMs actually flipped out disks, and they were using third-party services to do that. And there was a breach because the disks were not encrypted, and there was some data that was breached and went into wrong hands. Now, all goes back to the same philosophy here, that wherever there is data, you need to find a way to protect it, right? But how do you do that? And that is kind of very tricky, especially in today's world, which is so full of siloed applications all across the infrastructure. The challenge that cannot be solved is keeping all the data in one point. The data will be in different silos, or the applications will be siloed. But one of the most important considerations is enterprise manageability. A lot of people on this webinar as well are from large enterprises most of them have multi-operating system environments. So how do you manage a heterogeneous enterprise? And that's a big question and a big debate. Chris, how do enterprises even envision the enterprise manageability, even if it is in theory? Is there a better world?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is, and companies are clamoring for it today. You know, I mean, we've had this shift to cloud going on for some time. We've had an ecosystem that it's exploding with a lot more devices of a lot more variety. We live in a heterogeneous environment. We need to operate that way. I still go into a lot of companies where they've got, you know, separation. You got the Windows admins, you got the Linux admins, you got the desktop and server admins, you've got application owners who even vary a little bit from there. Each of them with different needs, but go one step above that tier and everything comes together. You need to show regulatory compliance across the environment. You need to show risk prioritization across the entire environment, agnostic of what types of devices, where they are, and so forth. So if you have separate tools to manage different you know, features of the same capability across different platforms, you're still going to have this basically consolidation one step above that. So choose how you want to do that. If you have niche products to do that, that's one way to approach it, and every team has their own, but then you're going to have an operational cost and a burden trying to pull the visibility together to prove everything is working well, and that you're compliant. If you choose to, you know, take it on holistically, they're, you know, taking the heterogeneous approach and managing everything from one system that can manage Linux, multiple flavors. It can manage Windows. It can manage Mac. It can manage mobile and client and server. It can manage cloud, prem. Having that heterogeneous device and environment support is very important in the world we live in today. As we, you know, get into 2021 here, most companies are expecting they're going to predominantly be working in this, you know, access from anywhere, access anything at any time kind of world that we live in now. So that's our reality, and we've got to manage it holistically. Ro, you're on mute.
Thanks, Chris. And heterogeneity is a big challenge, and like you said, a lot of enterprises are thinking about it, and there is a better world. Gary, what is important in the world of enterprise manageability, from an endpoint to a server to the whole enterprise?
Well, I mean, without echoing everything that Chris said, because I agree with all that. I mean, I can reemphasize, as we talked before, compliance, regulations, apply across all boundaries, and certainly attackers don't constrict or restrict themselves to any one silo. This became even more evident lately during the solar window attacks, where when the attackers got in, the number of subsequent lateral moves they made were across a whole number of different of silos. And so then the organization needs to be able to protect themselves holistically to protect against, for compliance, which is a holistic requirement, but also against attackers, which can be very ingenious and don't confine themselves to one area or the other. So in practice, when that comes down to the kind of things we're talking about, or full disk encryption, for instance, so it's not only Mac, you need to cover Mac, you need to cover Windows, you need to cover Linux, but not just Linux, a whole bunch of different flavors of Linux to manage those. And those things occur on the laptop, to the data center, to the cloud. So there's another dimension for them. And then with this, excuse me, full disk encryption, there's some sort of specific things, get a little technical, that you need for enterprise management. If it's a laptop, then for compliance and security reasons, then you need to have pre-boot authentication. So this is authentication before the operating system is even unlocked. And that's an operating system agnostic requirement. For some regulations, certainly government, you may need smart cards or PIP cards to unlock them. For others, passwords may be good enough, but certainly there would be password quality rules that needed to be enforced. All that stuff needs to be organized and enforced by the enterprise. And then when the day comes when the user loses a smart card or forgets their password, the enterprise system has to be able to help them recover really quickly and get them back in, or if they leave the operation altogether, for the enterprise to recover the data. And then even also more important, certainly for compliance point of view, if the computer or laptop goes lost or stolen, then how do you prove that it was encrypted, and how do you avoid that breach notification? Well, you have to have an enterprise system that will give you a very crisp report on the fact that it was encrypted, and with proper logs you can follow through to see that it wasn't decrypted. And you need software that the end user can't decrypt it because they think they might, on a whim. So that's laptops. On servers, a lot of that same stuff applies, but maybe the main difference is there's no pre-boot authentication often. You want the server to boot up unattended, but if it's encrypted, it's got to get the key somewhere. And so that best comes from some kind of central enterprise management that can supply that key. But the key needs to be supplied intelligently. So the enterprise management needs to make a policy-based decision whether or not to supply that key so that server can boot. And then there is getting from where you are to the encrypted or the managed state. And one of the issues there is that often with Linux machines, if you want to encrypt them, then basically you have to rebuild them and from start and transfer the data. So an enterprise system should be able to allow you to take an unencrypted machine and while it's online, encrypt it to a secure state without disrupting your operation too much. So there's a few examples of things getting down to the nitty-gritty that I think you need for enterprise management.
Thanks, Gary. And again, all of this is kind of difficult. And like Chris said, the CISOs are looking at a holistic picture. A lot of you who on this platform who are managing this really has to go through this from one step at a time, and really solve these problems step by step. So let me go and summarize this particular webinar in terms of what our key takeaways are for today. Again, it's difficult being you. So, but the first one is really about security. Linux has security vulnerabilities like any other system. So that notion has to go away. And the more or the earlier that we do that and assume that today or tomorrow we will be breached, we'll be more adaptive to this and really look at securing our Linux infrastructure as a part of our overall infrastructure in the same manner. Compliance, regulations, and all the laws are operating system agnostic. So they apply to what you manage today as well. So, and the most important one, which kind of tries to lead to a direction, which is really about the fact that you have data and you need to make sure that the data is protected. Wherever they decide, howsoever they are transmitted. The idea is to make sure that you have one platform to manage everything together, and that's probably the key. We are really at the end of this webinar. No time for questions, but I will leave give it to Chris and Gary to give a final comment before we wrap up. Chris?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is, platforms are platforms. Wherever there's data, wherever there's access, we need to ensure, security, visibility, and compliance on those systems. So that's a top priority for any organization, and one to help keep things secure and compliant so that you don't get into hot water if there's an incident down the road.
So echo that, wherever platforms are platforms, systems, they need to be managed, vulnerabilities need to be managed, and data is data, and wherever data is, laptop, data center, the cloud, it needs to be protected.
Yeah. Okay, thanks guys. Appreciate your time, and please do let us know if you have any questions. We do see some questions here. We'll make sure that all of you are responded to and have your questions are answered. Thank you for taking the time. We appreciate it, and see you next month in our next webinar. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rahul.
Bye.